And it's 9:04 here on London's Biggest Conversation, and it's the LBC Book Club. Every Monday night at 9 o'clock we open the book club. Tonight our guest is Alastair Campbell, former Director of Communications for Tony Blair. He's written his second volume of diaries, out at the moment, Power and the People. They cover 1997 to 1999. Now, if you have a question for Alastair, you can text me on 84850, or you can speak to the great man himself on 0845 6060 973. You can email ian@lbc.co.uk, or you can tweet me at LBC973. Well, welcome to the programme, Alastair.
Thank you, great man.
Well,
you'll get complaints
to the presenter.
No, you were saying that about me. You'll get complaints.
I don't know about that.
Yeah.
Right, let's go straight into the diary. This is the second volume. What makes a good diary? Because obviously we've had great political diarists like Tony Benn, Alan Clark, Richard Crossman, Barbara Castle. You've presumably read most of them. Mm-hmm. How do you make sure your diaries live up to theirs?
I don't know if I never really think of it in those terms, to be absolutely frank. I mean, I write a diary now. I've written a diary for many, many years. And when I'm writing it, I'm not thinking, how's this going to look and how's this going to compare with other diarists. I'm just writing a diary. When you say what do I think makes a good diary when it's published, I think it's a mixture of things. I think it's having an interesting life. I think it's having the capacity for detail, observational detail in particular. But I think if it's a political diary, and particularly mine, I think the difference would be between me and the people that you've described. They were all in pretty senior positions in politics, but I was, as it were, right at the centre. And I think that what my diary, I think, gives is a sense of just, this is no more than it can do, is kind of what it was like to be alongside Tony Blair as he was leader of the Labour Party and Prime Minister. And I think it gives a sense of the intensity of the experience, occasionally the kind of madness of it, the craziness of the lifestyle, but also, hopefully, a flavour of some of the big issues involved and also some of the big personalities. I don't think a diary can do much more than that, to be honest.
But when you were writing your diary, presumably mostly late at night, did you ever think to yourself, well, I can't write that because if these are published, it's just going to hurt that person too much?
No. When I edited it the first time round with the Blair years, I did think, not just people focused on Gordon Brown, but for lots of people I thought, no, that isn't fair, or that's just a bit harsh, or whatever. There are some things I've kept out. Some things either... I mean, I think you have to make judgments about this. There are some things that people have said to me about themselves that they've been absolutely clear they are absolutely said in confidence, and that's a confidence that's going to remain. But that's a very, very small number of people and issues. I think in the main, when you're talking about really big figures, I mean, this is the odd thing about having done what I did, is you're alongside people who are going to be studied in history books in centuries' time, and therefore they are historical figures. And I think that without being pompous about it, I think that when my whole diaries are out there will be a sense of that actually being something of a historical document, because it's of all the billions of words that get written about people in public life, it is actually a record of the centre from the centre, and there aren't many of those.
Because when you originally published the Blair years, which essentially was a condensation of the whole diaries down to one volume, I mean, I was quite critical at the time because I thought that you were publishing them at a time when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister, and I thought, well, there's no way he can be honest, and he will have edited so much interesting stuff out. And I mean, you kind of admitted that at the time.
I did.
And I just didn't think that. I mean, they were fascinating diaries, but I thought they did pull their punches, whereas what you've got in these two volumes now is, I guess, more or less the unexpurgated version.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing about... I mean, it's a fair point that you make, but the reason why I did the Blair years when I did was less to do with Gordon Brown than to do with Tony and the fact that he was leaving office. When Tony was about to leave office, I was getting literally dozens, possibly hundreds, of approaches from different parts of the media and books and television programmes and magazine articles and all that stuff about me saying what I thought of Tony Blair's legacy. And in the end I thought, sod it, I'll do my own. And I'll do my own based on the diary. And the Blair years was very much about...
So you hadn't decided before then? That was actually the moment that you decided to publish?
I'd actually decided, insofar as I'd made a decision, I'd always imagined I wouldn't do anything until we were out of power. But as it built up to when Tony left, I thought I'd just do that single volume. And the editing was very, very difficult because it's like something near 2 million words. You're getting down to 300,000, whatever it was. And what I decided in the editing of it was I wanted stuff that would kind of reflect upon Tony and various shades of his personality and his life. And then these, as you say now, are the full diaries. And there's a lot of new material in there. I mean, that one you've got there, 80% of it was not in the Blair years. That's a lot of new material. And
did he know that you were writing a diary?
He did. As to when he knew, did I tell him right at the start? Or I mean, I used to carry my diary around with me. It was like a big A4 notebook. And, you know, sometimes we'd be sitting on a plane and I'd be sitting scribbling. And he said, "Oh, God, you don't write your bloody diary." I said, "Yes,
and presumably there were occasions when he said, "That's not for the diary."
There were. And some of the...
Give us an example.
Well, they're all in there.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether I believe that. But
well, there's not... Tony was always pretty relaxed about it, to be honest. I can remember... I mean, it's fair to say that others were less... I remember Gordon once saying to Tony, "Look, you know, why are you letting him keep this diary?" And he said, "Look, if he's kind of just saying what he sees and what he thinks, what's the problem with that? Because he says what he thinks anyway."
Well, I mean, having read the diaries, I can understand why Gordon Brown would ask that question, because, I mean, he doesn't... Well, we'll come on to him a little bit later, but he doesn't emerge from the diaries very well. In fact, most of the people that you talk about, with the possible exception of John Prescott, actually emerge as slightly warped characters, I would say.
I think what you get from most of the characters, including myself, is...
Well, you certainly fall into that category.
Exactly, is a mixed picture. I mean, I can honestly say that I like and admire Tony more at the end of working for him than I did at the beginning. I think he's a great guy, and I think he was a terrific Prime Minister. But along the way, there were times when he drove me absolutely up the wall. Gordon, interestingly, I wrote the introduction to this book before Tony's book came out, and we both used exactly the same phrase about Gordon, which is that he could be brilliant.
Psychologically flawed.
No, he could be brilliant, but also impossible.
Yeah. And
the fact is, I think you're right that parts of the book, if you were Gordon Brown, you probably wouldn't want to read, but other parts, you see the brilliance as well, and I don't think we should forget that. And I think for all the people in it, look, we're all complicated. And I think particularly in modern politics, where the pressures are pretty intense, the media drives you up the bloody wall most of the time, then it's quite difficult to sort of swim along as a perfectly formed person. Funny enough, I think the one person who comes out consistently in the same way and very well is Philip Gould, but that's partly because he's maybe a bit detached from the rest.
He was Tony Blair's pollster.
Yeah, and a strategist, yeah. But John Prescott, I agree, I think John does come out very, very well.
Which I think a lot of people might be quite surprised by. But he seemed to understand the conflicts that there were constantly, almost from the beginning, in 1994, between Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, and actually did his level best to try and broker peace. And indeed between, if you like, New and Old Labour, where he was very much a sort of brokering person within that as well. No, look, John is one of those guys who... He shouts and bawls and he can be, you know, blustering and all the rest of it, but there's a big heart there. And I think he also, as a deputy, because he was the deputy leader, he understood that part of his job was kind of almost to think what it was like for Tony. And I think sometimes in politics people don't spend enough time thinking what it is like for other people, particularly the guys at the very top. You became a bit of a lightning rod, I think, for Tony Blair, maybe, and the government in general. And, I mean, I think you actually became a hate figure for people, not just on the right, but also some on the left. Was that difficult to cope with?
Well, I'll be honest with you, I never really felt that. Because I think I learnt early on that there's a very big difference between the media world and the Westminster Village and what's happening out in the real world. I mean, for example, I think there are something like 28 mentions of going to Burnley games in the diaries at various
28
points. And that's because I couldn't keep putting the results in of games that we'd drawn or lost. But only once in every single time I went out to a football match did I get any kind of grief from members of the public. And likewise, I think the media, I think the left-wing press, a lot of them didn't like us because they didn't think we were left-wing enough. The right-wing press hated us because we kept winning elections. And I think the broadcasters eventually turned against us because of Iraq. I think that I was definitely a lightning rod, but so at times was Peter Mandelson, so was Derry Irvine, so was Charlie Faulkner.
But even now, I mean, when I mentioned on Twitter that you were coming on the programme, I mean, the abusive tweets that followed that, which presumably you see a lot of them, I mean, it goes beyond the normal, doesn't it?
But I don't know. Look, I think if you're anybody who's been either seen as a divisive figure or has been in some ways a divisive figure, or if you just got, I think it happens to anybody who's got quite a high profile. I mean, it was the same last week when I was on Question Time, sort of avalanche. But then when I went on the programme, there was, I'm not saying an avalanche, but there were an awful lot of tweets that went the other way. Piers Morgan at the moment, put Piers Morgan's name in there and you get loads and loads of stuff saying how terrible he is and how awful and all this stuff. I think you just have to develop a very, very thick skin and understand the difference. You see, if people that knew me really well thought that of me, that would worry me. But I know that they don't, because they know me really well and they know who I am and they know what I am. So for somebody who knows nothing more than what they've read in kind of vile organs like the Daily Mail, which is sort of blot on the landscape of humanity, then no wonder they're not going to like you very much. But it doesn't matter. Ultimately, it doesn't matter.
The same Daily Mail that you were trying to get on side when you were doing the job, I suppose it was
well,
your
a little
job.
bit. We gave up. When did we give up? Long before the millennium. I don't think I've spoken to the evil that is Paul Dacre for about a decade.
On that note, we're going to go to the travel.
He's the editor, by the way. Those who read his
Alan
rag.
Joyce.
Programme podcasts, go to lbc.co.uk/podcasts.
You're listening to the LBC Book Club with me, Ian Dale. Alastair Campbell is my guest this week. If you'd like to ask him a question, 0845 6060 973 is the number to call. You can text 84850 or email ian@lbc.co.uk. Right, let's take a couple of questions from listeners. Colin says, on Question Time last week, George Galloway called you Blair's Goebbels. Did you think he just went that little bit over the top?
It's not the first time you said it, and it's not the first time I've heard it, so it didn't really bother me at all, to be absolutely frank.
I mean, I was watching that yesterday, and he clearly hates you.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, he's faced me in court, in a case that I won. He's in relation to, we had a lot of battles in the Labour Party. Also, back in the days when I was a Mirror journalist, I wrote some articles about him and his conduct at War on Want, which he didn't like. I think hatred is not too strong a word, but you see, that's the difference. I think there are very, very few people that I hate. When I bumped into him in the green room, I didn't sort of feel, God, I really hate that guy. What I thought was, I think your politics is absolutely, revolting.
But you didn't really react when he said that. I thought, I mean, if it had been me, I would have exploded.
Yeah, but the thing is, I decided, and I think it was the right decision to make. I'd decided really that whatever he said, I would just almost pretend he wasn't there and just deal with the questions, serious questions that were put to me about Iraq. So I engaged much more with David Dimbleby and Simon Hughes and the audience, and Galloway just went off on one of his rants. And I mean, I think he's a pretty discredited figure. I didn't mention the Big Brother thing. I did mention his grovelling at the feet of Saddam Hussein, but it didn't really, guys like that just don't get to me, and I think that's one of the reasons why they end up hating me as much as they do. Because although I have got a temper, but if somebody like that tries to get to me, he's not going to get to me.
Here's a question on Twitter. What do you think of Andy Coulson's actual job performance rather than the baggage that surrounded it?
I'm not really in a position to answer that because I'm not in that world as much as I used to be. I've got to say, I thought the Tory campaign was pretty poor, and he was an important part of that. If you think about it, I've said this to you before privately, that if you look at the economic and political playing field as it was for the last election, the Tories should have walked it, and they didn't. And I think that's because they fought a very, very poor campaign, in part. As to what he did in Downing Street, I mean, people within Number 10, the political people speak very highly of him, but a lot of the media people I spoke to say that once, because of the News of the World thing hanging around him, he wasn't really engaging that much. So look, I think I always got on perfectly well with him. And also, to be absolutely honest, I think the issue now goes way beyond Andy Coulson. I think there's some really big issues here about Rupert Murdoch, about B-Sky B and this takeover with News Corp, and also about the conduct of the police, which I think has just been absolutely disgraceful, and nobody has got anywhere near the bottom of it yet, but I think people will keep digging away.
Do you fear your phone was hacked?
I would be very surprised if it wasn't. in fact, lots and lots of people within that world have sort of said, you would have been an absolute prime target. And it was interesting seeing that story yesterday about Tony. I knew that Tony didn't have a mobile phone,
so he couldn't use one.
No, because it was partly because he'd always be with somebody, bodyguards or a driver or me or Jonathan Powell, whatever. So the switchboard used to contact him through us. So I'd be very, very surprised if I hadn't have been on that sort of list. And, to be honest, we were always briefed to be very, very careful about talking on mobile phones anyway.
You don't sound particularly bothered by that, though. I mean, again, I would be furious if I thought that someone had hacked
I
into
don't
my
know.
phone. Is that because you come from the tabloid world yourself?
No.
And you knew it went on?
No, in fact, to be absolutely honest, I am thinking about exploring it much further. One of the reasons why I've never bothered before is that partly maybe because I did come from a journalistic background, I think you'd have to be pretty stupid as a journalist to start playing around with hacking into phones that the Prime Minister might be speaking to regularly. I suppose that's why I thought, probably not. But now that you see that, John Prescott's in there, Tessa Jowell's in there, Simon Hughes I see, there's all sorts of political figures. So I think there's this story. I think if people think Andy Coulson's departure was the end of it, I think it's just the beginning.
John the Cabbie, who's a regular correspondent of the programme, he says, if the coalition breaks, will it be the Tory right rather than the Lib Dems that will engineer the fracture?
I'm not sure that either will necessarily want to engineer the fracture. I think the Tory right would be keener to engineer the fracture, but I think if it does end, it will just be events that, as yet, we cannot really predict. When the coalition was first formed, I did not have the view that this would fall apart anytime soon. I think it's there and can be there for some considerable period of time. I do think Nick Clegg's in considerable difficulty. I think he's been manoeuvred into a very, very bad place. I think Cameron's got him exactly where he wants him. I think that what flows now in relation to the economy, as ever, is going to decide how this thing plays out. But I think as of now, the Lib Dems, I think, are in far greater trouble than they should have been, based upon what they thought they were bringing to the coalition.
Well, we'll come back to the subject matter of your volume of diaries, because they cover 1997 to 1999 in just a second. But let's take a phone call from John in Wandsworth. Good evening, John.
Good evening, Ian. Good evening, Alastair.
Hello.
It's a very, very simple question. I mean, people say you're in the front line, but have you ever thought of going right into the front line, i.e. considering running for a seat in Parliament, or even maybe a stab at a future point of Mayor of London?
Well, I have thought about the former, and I thought about it, I suppose, most seriously in the same election when David Miliband, James Pennell, lots of other special advisors went there. But at the time, I felt I was a kind of round peg in a round hole, and the job that I was doing was the right job for me, and more importantly, it was the right job for Tony Blair and for the government, and going into the next election for the Labour Party. On the mayor thing, I don't. It's funny. I've lived in London for a long, long, long time, but I don't really consider myself to be a Londoner in the same way as most Londoners do. And funny enough, last week we were talking about my Question Time appearance at Burnley last week. Lots of people came up to me afterwards and said, look, why don't you stand for Labour in the next election, give the Liberals a run for their money, and blah, blah, blah. I don't say no, but I'm 53 now, and I know that's not old, but I kind of feel that full-time 24/7 politics, which if you do it properly, I'm afraid that's what it is, I don't know if I could go through that again.
But John, thanks for your call. Do you not get fed up, though, with being described as the former something? Wouldn't you like to be a current something?
But I don't really care how people describe me. I've sort of given up worrying about things like that. Look, you could say...
Well, you are a current author.
You could say that,
but
or you could do...
Do you not want another big job that you can
really
I do.
Get your teeth probably
stuck
do,
into?
and I think there is definitely another big job left in me. I'm sure of that. But I think that, you see, it's been quite interesting for me. 1990, when did I first work for Tony? 1994. And I was already getting a bit tired of journalism, and I was actually thinking about maybe trying to find a seat or some sort of political step that I was going to make. And then John Smith died, and Tony became leader, and he asked me to do the job that he did. And I did that from 94, full-time from 94 to 2003. When I left, I knew I was going back for the 2005 campaign. So for those 2 years, I just kind of messed around and did a few different things and had a sort of quiet life. And then I did other things, and I've done lots with leukemia and lymphoma research and mental health charities, Lions Tour, fundraising for different organisations on the circuit and all that stuff. But I also knew that I was going to be involved in helping the orderly transition from Tony to Gordon, and then Gordon started to try and get me back in to help him. So I don't mind how I'm seen, I really don't, and I don't mind what I'm described as. But you're right, I probably do have another job in me. What it is, I don't at this stage know. But I wouldn't rule out what John's just raised.
What, running for Parliament or Mayor of London?
The former, not the latter.
Thought we had a scoop on our hands there. Jane in Ilford says, Alastair, have you ever thought about writing another novel? Well, you've just had one published, haven't you? Maya.
Yeah, but I wrote it well over a year ago. I've got another novel. I've started it 5 times, which is not a good sign.
Not a good sign, is it?
But that being said, how can I put this? It's set in the coalition. That's all I'm saying.
Oh, really? Oh,
yeah.
That sounds good.
But I can't get going.
Is that an LBC exclusive?
No, probably. I've never told it to anybody else. But I've got 2 more volumes of diaries this year, so that's going to keep me moderately busy.
I think it probably will. Well, you're listening to the LBC Book Club with me, Ian Dale, and Alastair Campbell. If you'd like to ask Alastair a question, 0845 6060
4850 Ian Dale.
And I'm here with you until 10 o'clock on London's Biggest Conversation. But Clive Bull will be here after 10, and he joins us now to tell us what's on his programme. Hi.
Yep, I'll be here at 10. We're going to look at the Olympic Stadium, which is an issue that's been rumbling on for a while.
Dear to my heart.
I know, yeah. It's been postponed. Now, is that because it's such a difficult decision, or is it because actually none of the proposals are very good at the moment? I know it is close to your heart. Do you want to go there?
Well, I do, although I don't really want the running track, but I know that's part of the deal.
Well,
but I think
problem.
what they might be doing is going back to the original idea and saying we will keep an athletic stadium with a 25,000 capacity. In which case, why doesn't Leyton Orient move there instead of West Ham or Tottenham? I think that's the direction that they might be going in.
Is it too late to just not have the Olympics?
No, you can't have that.
Oh,
Get
for
off.
goodness sake.
Get off.
They allow him on
Out
there,
of
you know,
here.
to say these things.
Well, it's just,
gonna be great.
This late stage, and they still don't know what to do with it. So we're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about energy and this idea that's been floated of having kind of tokens, rationing of energy around. So not just for petrol, but also for your household fuel as well. Is that a runner at all?
That would be about number 3 in my 10 easy ways to lose an election.
Yeah. Yes, well, obviously be
Apparently the
introduced
Tories
just
are
after
doing
that.
it. The Tories have got that as a
How
plan.
would you spin that, Alastair Campbell?
I think you'd have to do a very big, long-term environmental campaign.
I think you would.
And you'd have to scare a lot of people.
Announce it after the election. And we'll talk about... there's figures suggesting that there's extra interest this April in travelling abroad. And is this because people want to get away from the royal wedding, or are you planning to do something special to celebrate it?
We'll leave that question hanging
There we
until
are.
the time that you
Thank you
look at
very
it
much.
after 10. Clive Bull, we'll see you later. Thank you very much indeed. Well, I'm with Alastair Campbell. He's talking about his book, The Alastair Campbell Diaries, Volume 2, Power and the People, 1997 to 1999, to give it its full title. Massive hardback, published by Hutchinson. Is it Hutchinson?
Yeah,
It
yep.
is. £25, but obviously you can get it cheaper all over the place.
Well, and also Volume 1 is out in paperback now.
Is it
same
now?
day.
Well,
$9.99, Ian.
Well done you.
Yeah.
Now, let's turn to some of the subject matter in this. Psychological flaws. Now, that's sort of been hanging like a noose around your neck for a long time, but actually, the explanation for who called Gordon Brown psychologically flawed, I actually thought was rather boring.
Yeah, the thing is about this, it's a bit like People's Princess. Some of these phrases, they just catch on and become just part of the political language, and actually when you go back to it, it's all rather mundane. Well, I don't think that one was mundane. I mean, I'll tell you what happened. it came through during a period of what we call the TBGBs, when things have been really not good.
That's for all 13 years, isn't it?
No, there were times when it was good, honestly. But there was a really bad period. I think it was somebody had written a book, and it was all just really horrible and messy, and Tony and Gordon weren't getting on, and I was really having a bad time with some of Gordon's people. And most Saturdays, I used to phone around all the Sunday commentators, find out what they were up to, talk to them, try and sort of, put our point of view on whatever it was they were discussing. And Andrew Rawnsley, the Observer, was writing a piece about the TBGBs, as it were, and I did go over the top. I didn't actually say Gordon was psychologically flawed, but I did say that anybody who thought Tony would ever have lost to him in a leadership election needed their head looking at. And so I played into a story that I think Andrew was writing anyway. And it was one of those things where you just kind of, you let your guard down, but you're in a sense too open, and what becomes a kind of what you think is a conversation that's feeding in a few thoughts for a column, when it's presented as a screaming front page story, it looks very, very different. So I can't say that I felt good about that. In fact, as I record in the diary, I felt wretched about it for days and days and days, and I was, and as you say, it's been kind of thrown at me ever since.
Because Lance Price, who was your deputy...
he wasn't. He keeps saying he wasn't. He wasn't my deputy.
He?
No,
I thought he was.
Well, no, he wasn't.
I remember interviewing him about 5 years ago on an internet TV channel, and he told me on that programme, he didn't quite tell me, but he strongly hinted that it was actually Cherie Blair that had said that.
People will have all sorts of theories, and I thought you were going to say that Tony had said it, because that was the other theory that went around. Was actually,
well, you could certainly understand it.
Tony.
Some of the rows that they have. Not necessarily so much in this volume, but in the previous volume.
Wait for the next one.
Well, but how can you run a government? The message that, and okay, our politics are rather different, but I read these books and I just think, well, how on earth did they manage to run a government for that length of time when the two main protagonists were basically at each other's throats? Not just them, Peter Mandelson as well. And you just think, how did they even...
Well, I think the answer, in part, is because Tony did have this extraordinary ability to absorb it and also rise above it. And I'm not pretending that sometimes he didn't find it really, really difficult, or just avoid it. But you see, the point is, I say in the introduction that you go to certain parts of the book where Gordon's being impossible, and you think, well, why didn't he just get rid of him? And the answer to that is because he was also brilliant. And he was, and there were parts of Gordon that were absolutely brilliant. One of my favourite bits in the book is when I describe his first day in the Treasury, when he's doing. I went over to help with the kind of announcement on the Bank of England independence, and you just felt this kind of power and this energy, and the Treasury was just. It was totally energised by his presence and his intellectual thinking and so forth. And so it's never so simple. And also, as you know from your study of history and politics, it's all very well to say, well, it's so obvious he should have got rid of him, but actually you just don't know. You didn't know whether there was anybody else who could do the job as well. You didn't know whether actually he might have been more difficult outside than inside. All those are calculations, and in the end, let's be frank, we did win 3 general elections, and we did manage to make an awful lot of change, and a lot of that was down to Tony and Gordon working together. When they worked together, they were brilliant.
It sounds, from what you've said, as if you were very lonely in that job, that you were Tony Blair's crutch on many things, but there wasn't anyone really for you to rely on. You described terrible rows that you had with your partner Fiona, and that she didn't understand some of the pressures that were on you. And I think you're incredibly honest in that. And there was one passage that really struck me when you're talking about your best friend John Merritt, who died from leukemia, and his daughter Ellie, who you also talk about her a lot in this book, because she died as well, and you chart that in a very moving way. But there's this sentence just hit me. Someone asked me the other day who my best friend was, and in truth I didn't have one, not like John, and I wished he was here. I just don't know how Lindsay copes. Now that was a reference to Ellie's mother and John's wife, but to say that you couldn't actually name a best friend, I thought, well, isn't that typical of people in politics? And I think that, of all the years I've been involved in politics, I'd probably count 5 people in politics who I would regard as real friends. We all have friends in inverted commas, but very few real ones.
Well, I would say, actually, it was my son who said that. It was Callum, my middle son, who said that. But I would say that, I mean, it's true. I've actually lost 3 of my closest friends who've died young. But I would say, as you go through the book, Philip Gould emerges as a really good friend. Alex Ferguson emerges as a really good friend. He's sort of on the. I mean, he and I go back quite a long way, and he's on the phone when the SHIT is flying, and he's a good friend.
So that was most days.
Yeah. Godric, who was my civil service number 2, he became a very, very good friend and still is. And the other thing to remember is Tony was a good boss, and although he worked me incredibly hard. And as you say, at times I had to, as it were, be his crutch. When I always knew I could sort of go to Tony and say, look, I'm worried about this. I've got a problem with this. And so he, I think you find the people, but it's where you're absolutely right. It's been interesting, the people I've stayed very close to now that I'm no longer fully involved. I'm still very close to Tessa Jow, still very friendly with Charlie Faulkner.
I dreamt about her the other night.
You dreamt about Tessa?
I did, yeah.
What was that about?
I dreamt that we were taking dogs for a walk.
Okay.
Don't know why.
Well, fine.
Just one of those things that happens.
Okay, have you told her?
Not yet.
She'll
but
be
I will.
chuffed a bit.
She'll come in soon.
So you get, I think the thing about friendship in politics, though, is that, I mean, I guarantee that Fiona's mum will be listening, Audrey, because she tracks, she's my one-person media monitoring, and she does listen to your programme, but she's always quoting that thing, if you want to get a friend in politics, get a dog. But I'm not sure that's absolutely right. I've got good friends, but I did. This started out with you saying, did it ever feel lonely? The answer is yes, it did.
And there's a lot of blubbering in this book, and people see you as, I think, a very macho character, and yet you're not afraid to write about all the times that you have a good cry. And, I mean, there are many of them in this volume.
Well, I am quite lachrymose. In fact, when the Blair years came out, Rory, my eldest son, he said, "Dad, do we have to deal with all this crying crap?"
He's obviously
but I do.
Fiona's side of the family, then.
No, but I do, and I am quite emotional. I mean, it's for example, you were talking about the Olympic stadiums there. I cannot watch an Olympic medal ceremony
me neither.
without crying.
Absolutely,
I don't care what country it is. When I see that flag and I hear the national anthem, and I see that sense of achievement, I cried at the elections, Diana's death.
And when Carlos Tevez comes to Upton Park and does the Hammers sign, that sets me off. And I'm sure you can have a similar moment from Burnley.
I did have a little weep when we got promoted a couple of years ago. Yeah.
But are you surprised at the reaction to some of those passages, though? Because, I mean, the way you talk about this little girl, Ellie, who died of leukemia, I mean, it's incredibly moving, the way you write about it. And it had such an effect on you. And yet, it didn't, I mean, from the bits I've read so far, nobody else quite understood that.
Yeah, but I think that's because people, they like caricatures. The media like caricatures. I mean, you're, without sort of blowing your trumpet for you, you're interested in politics and you're interested in people and you're interested in doing things in depth, which is why you've gone into the whole publishing side of things and that sort of thing. But I think most people in the modern media, they like things that fit their caricature. So if I could probably write most of the reviews of this book for most of the papers, knowing that they'll review me rather than review the book. They wouldn't look at something like that because they don't want it, because it doesn't fit what they think of you. So, and again, it just doesn't bother me. I mean, I'm somebody who likes to get something good out of anything bad. So something like John dying and Ellie dying, that has led directly to what I now do for leukemia and lymphoma research. And that again has opened up a whole new world for me of people and contacts and ideas, and it's a great charity, and the whole sport thing. I mean, me running around doing marathons, triathlons, all that stuff, that all flowed directly from
Madness.
that. Total madness, but it comes from that. And fun enough, Hope's Ellie's sister Hope, who never met her dad. I mean, Lindsay was pregnant when John died, and she's got a big birthday coming up. And it's just. I don't know. I'm somebody who I don't care what most people think about me. There are some people I really care what they think about me, and I think actually most of us are like that. And I think the whole, you mentioned my last novel, Maya. It's about kind of modern celebrity, and I think the whole sort of celebrity world, if you allow yourself to worry too much about what this paper says and what that magazine says, I mean, honestly, you'd go completely bonkers.
Well, you're listening to the LBC Book Club with me, Ian Dale, and Alastair Campbell. It's 10:15. And here's Alan.
Conversation with me, Clive Bull, tonight from 10.
And I have Alastair Campbell with me in the studio. He's the author of, the Alastair Campbell Diaries, surprisingly, Volume 2, Power and the People, 1997 to 1999. I suppose Northern Ireland is one of the biggest, forms part of the biggest part of this volume of diaries. And the entry on the
tears there, weren't there?
Oh, absolutely, there were. And the entry on the Good Friday Agreement, I mean, is a brilliant read. I mean, it's so dramatic. How did you actually think at ever that would happen, or
No.
was it more in hope than expectation?
No, not at all. In fact, it's really interesting going back to it. And there was a review in the Observer at the weekend that said that, it said nothing interesting or new about Northern Ireland. And I thought that was really odd, because I'm glad you said what you did, because I can still read the Northern Ireland bits and find things that surprise me.
Because often I skip through Northern Ireland bits.
No, I think a lot of people do.
I'll
tell you what happened on that is we were stuck in this horrible soulless building in Belfast, the Castle Buildings, where we were doing the negotiations. And there came a point, I can't remember when it was, but there came a point sort of 2 days in when I sort of felt something's kind of happening here. And I started to record it literally minute by minute. So, I did have a sense there, the old word, the histor, the person who records history. I did sort of feel that was partly what I was doing. And I say in the book that if you said to me, explain how it happened, I couldn't. I just couldn't explain it. And I don't think Tony could, I don't think Bertie Ahern could, I don't think Trimble could, I don't think Adams and McGuinness could. It somehow came together. And it was fantastic. I mean, I think that of all the days I had, that was the best, I think. It was just the most extraordinary feeling of this amazing thing coming together. And even though everybody knew that was just the start rather than the end, it was just a wonderful, magical moment. It was almost mystical the way it came together. And funny enough, I'm actually going to Ireland the week after next. I'm spending a week in Ireland because there's a lot of interest in the Irish, media and public in that bit of the book. And I'm doing a bit of radio presenting, as it happens.
Well, are you?
I am indeed. And but the point is that I also think it's important that people who constantly say, well, all Tony Blair ever did was take the country to war in Afghanistan and Iraq. Tony Blair is the Prime Minister who seems to have brought peace to Northern Ireland. That is an incredible achievement.
Yeah, well, I would agree with that, and I think when you look back on that period from 50 years hence, I suspect, obviously Iraq's going to feature fairly high, but I think even Tony Blair's worst enemy would surely have to admit that he played a leading role in bringing that about. Peter Mandelson. Now, I mean, your relationship with him, I mean, reading the first volume and this volume is fascinating. The further it goes on, the worse your opinion of him seems to get.
Yeah, but it's back to the ups and downs thing, isn't it? I mean, I worked with him very, very well in the last election. We both went back to help Gordon. We worked pretty well. I really didn't like his book, and he knows that. I thought it was awful.
I loved it.
Yeah, and exactly. You loved it.
Not for that reason. I actually thought it was a good book. You could tell that he had written it, which is important in those kind of books. And actually, when you compared a lot of the events that he was describing to events that you've described, actually, they weren't that dissimilar.
No, they weren't that dissimilar. But what I felt about it, that from the whole sort of projection of it, and the silly advert, and the third man, and all that it was about. I mean, I think I'm a team player, and I've always tried to understand other members of the team. I felt that was a very... I mean, I say in the introduction, I thought it was incredibly self-indulgent.
Well, it was. It was the vainest book I've ever read. But actually...
I didn't like it.
But it was still a good book, I would say.
Yeah, I'm not saying it wouldn't be readable and so forth, but I felt Peter... Put it this way, I think Peter was a very important political figure in the whole New Labour thing, but I think it would have been far better if he'd have let other people say it.
Has your relationship with him sort of shattered over your comments on his book?
No, I wouldn't say it was shattered, and I still have a lot of regard for Peter. But look, we had a lot of ups and downs. I think the other thing that his book showed me was that he continues to believe that his second resignation was decided by me, and I don't think he's ever been able to accept that actually it was Tony who felt that he had to go. And the depth of that became clear to me. But anyway, look, I still think Peter's got a lot of talent and so forth. But I'd be lying if I said we were as close as we used to be.
Let's take a call from Will, who is in New Barnet. Hi, Will.
Hi, Ian. Hi, Alastair.
Hello.
Hi there. I'm just very interested to know how the press really has become the new establishment of society, how that's become about, and how we're going to try and get politics back onto the top of the moral high ground out of all of this. I'm thinking of Margaret Thatcher at the time when she was handed on television many years ago after the Falklands War, just around the time of the Falklands War, and she was on children's TV and put under immense pressure to answer how the Belgrano had been turned or sunk or whatever it was, and she really floundered horribly and gave a pathetic answer, which was totally, in my view, totally covered up by the press afterwards.
I don't think it was on children's TV. It was on
Nationwide, wasn't it? Yeah.
Oh yeah, but it was really. Yeah, I'm sure it was recasted on that. All of those things, and it just seems incredible to me that she could have got away with that. The same standards to Tony Blair with all what he's going through at the moment. Just they do not equate. And if you think of the brilliant Andrew Marr, his book on the history of politics and how important it's been for prime ministers to be in the wake of US presidents, and what a balance you have to draw between that, I find it totally abhorrent that we've ended up in this situation where editors of newspapers have so much ridiculously more power than anybody in any form of politics, whether the Prime Minister or anybody below that.
Well, thanks for that. Is that really right, though? Aren't politicians just as much to blame? I mean, you catalogue many instances in these diaries of you've got so-and-so, Anthony Bevins, Tom Baldwin, whoever, to write a story favourable to you, and you say, well, good on them, they've done a good job. This relationship between the media and politicians is parasitic on both sides, isn't it?
There's an element of truth in that, but I think an awful lot more people think like your caller does than people in the media realise. I think the public are absolutely sick of the way that politics is covered in this country. And I think that you've seen it recently with this phone hacking thing, where you're talking about what appears to be widespread criminality. But somebody sent me today a link of a report that was done by the Information Commissioner a few years ago about the unlawful trade in private information, where the Daily Mail was way out ahead of any of the other papers, including the Sunday tabloids. And I really do think that was Ian. I think he's got a point that the politician, now, where I think the political class has to do a better job is in standing up against it much better. I mean, when you get onto the next volume of my diaries, which I think is out in June, that's when Tony and I start to fall out a bit about having very different views about how to deal with this. Because I do believe, as your caller does, that this has become a problem for what we are as a democracy and how that makes us as a country. But nobody in politics, or very few people in politics, are willing to stand up and say it. John Prescott is one. I suspect that I think Boris has kind of got tendencies on this, even though he comes from the journalistic class. He sort of does tend to just go out there and say what he thinks. And I think if politicians would just be more confident in striking their own poses and striking their own postures and get out there and...
But doesn't that go back to what your old friend David Davis was saying yesterday, that the fact that there's so few real people, if you can describe them as that, at the top of politics now, you've got politics by special advisor now. All three party leaders are effectively identikit people. They've had no experience of the real world, really. They're all ex-special advisors, spent most of their time worked in politics.
That's true, but politics is the real world. I think there's a problem that, for some reason, we seem to think our leaders should be very, very young. I mean, the last election, Barack Obama was young, but John McCain was well into his 70s.
But I mean, going back to what you said earlier, you're reluctant to go into politics because you'd be 56, 57 at the next election. In America, you'd be a comparative youth.
That's true, and maybe we should start to get back to that. But I do think that, you know, you've had a situation now where in the last Parliament MPs were absolutely lacerated over their expenses, whether they fiddled them or they didn't. Every single MP got tarred with the same brush. You never heard about MPs who actually didn't charge expenses. You only heard about the bad ones. And I think this phone hacking thing and the attendant practices that the journalists get up to, I think that, in fact, Robert Peston said in his blog today that News International are worried that this is going to become the kind of equivalent of MPs' expenses for journalists. So I think your caller really has a point, and I think a lot of people think it.
When we spoke about a year ago, when I did a print interview with you, you said when you heard about the death of David Kelly, it hit you like a juggernaut. Is there any part of you that feels in any way responsible for what happened?
I mean, that is difficult because, in a sense, if put it this way, if I had never had a dispute with the BBC, then the whole thing would never have become an issue. You can say that. However, I think it would have been possible not to have had that dispute with the BBC because of the nature of the allegations they were making. And so I don't deny that I think about it a lot, and it's a sort of something I will always think about. But the reality is, if the BBC had not broadcast something that was completely and totally untrue, then none of those events would have followed.
And in 20 seconds, describe the current status of your relationship with Adam Bolton.
Well, I went on his programme last week and I got a text message from Man United's old goalkeeper, Peter Schmeichel, just as I walked into the studio, and he said, "Be nice to him today." And I think it was a brilliant piece of advice, and so I was. I still think he lost his marbles on that occasion on College Green. And anyway, enough said.
I think probably enough said. We've got a text here. It's a job suggestion for you. Big job for the future. England manager. I can see you doing that.
I want to be. Listen, I did apply for the Burnley manager's job.
Did you?
And they thought it was a joke. They thought it was a joke. And they've appointed somebody who's 31.
Unfortunately, we've come to the end of our hour. Alastair, thanks ever so much for joining us. Next week, it's Peter Sissons. Coming up next, Clive Bull. This is LBC 90.